What is one decision that they can make this week to take back in ownership of their life?
Have the courage, and I really do mean that, to ask yourself, what do you want? What do I want? And then write it down. Write it down because research shows that when we write things down, they're much more likely to happen. The other reason I encourage people to write things down is I find that in here, but like in your head, if it all lives here and it doesn't get out here, that's where people struggle with taking action.
Yeah.
So if I even just get it from my head to a piece of paper, that is at least in itself an action. I have written it down. And that there shows you can take action. And I can also, once I've written something down, I can interact with it because it's outside of myself. It's not just inside of myself. Think about it. So I really think that that's what I would encourage someone to do right away.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Root, Realign, and Rise podcast, where we explore what it truly means to root in truth, to realign with what matters, and to rise with responsibility in the leadership and the life that we have. Today's conversation is about reinvention, but not in the way that people usually talk about. This isn't about starting over. It's about taking ownership of your life when things don't go as planned. My guest today is Blake Cooper Griffin, an actor with credits across Netflix, HBO, and Marvel, and he's the author of The Story of You, A Life Rewritten. But what makes Blake's story different isn't just his success, it's the rebuild. From being dropped by representation early in his career to navigating identity, rejection, and starting over, Blake has built a life that isn't dependent on one path working out. In this conversation, we talk about the identity, the control, and what it actually takes to rewrite your life when the original plan falls apart. Blake, I am so happy to have you here. I have been so excited for this conversation for a while. So I think that you have a fantastic story of rebuild, but I think just overall in general, I watch your social media and I feel like I know you already.
Well, thank you. And thank you so much for having me on. I think I mentioned to you just as we were signing on that I've had a chance to listen to the podcast and I'm a fan. And so I'm really excited to be here too. And it's nice to share some time with you.
Oh, thank you. So let's start early on because obviously people need to know who Blake is. Early in your life and your career, you faced bullying and pressure around your identity. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that shaped how you saw yourself during that time?
Absolutely. So I grew up in South Carolina, a beautiful place, and great, friendly, wonderful people. I love going back. But like many, middle school was not a blast for me. And we moved a lot too, which is like tough on a kid, you know. I mean, we were lucky that my dad was such a great provider and my mom as well, but we moved a lot with his job. And so we moved all over the South and we landed somewhere in the 7th grade. You know, I started facing a lot of bullying. And the page 1 of my book, The Story of You, A Life Rewritten, is, introduces you to the 7th grade Blake walking into an 8th grade classroom. We had these free periods where you had to volunteer for the office or whatnot. And that was my day. And I went in and was delivering a note and someone lobbed a homophobic slur at me and in front of 30 people in a classroom. Everyone was laughing, raining down on me. The teacher didn't stop it. She chuckled. And it wasn't the first time that had happened. It certainly wasn't going to be the last. But in that moment, I remember going into the hallway and thinking, I had a panic attack in the hallway. Later learned that. But I remember thinking, Blake, you're just going to have to accept that this is your life because it was happening so much. Yeah. You're just going to have to accept that this is your life. But something in that moment, I didn't. And I remember thinking, because that was so humiliating as a 7th grader, new to the school, that there was some sort of whisper or encouragement that I had. And, certainly I've gotten lots of encouragement in my life, but I remember making a different choice that day. And I just chose to believe that this would not be my story. And as I say in the book, my experience, the external experience, didn't change that much after that day. I was still a lonely kid in South Carolina or I was in North Carolina at the time, who didn't always have someone to eat lunch with. But I had signed on to the tiniest kernel of belief that things could improve. And that was enough to at least take the next step forward. And I faced that choice time and again, with a spiritual counselor who, I talk about in chapter 6, who, you know, basically tried to, put me through conversion therapy basically at the time. And, I fought back, I made a choice to not sign on to that as a minor. And then, as you said, I continue to face, even in my career later, that same choice. But what I hope really is that, this is not a book for someone that has had my exact experience. What I find is when I've gotten more honest about my own life and about my own struggles and about my own challenges and about my own imperfections, is that other people's stories had different content, but often we're all looking to overcome, for encouragement, looking for hope. And my desire with the story of you is to give those whispers of encouragement, those kernels of hope that I was given, to the reader. That's my hope.
I love that because I absolutely sign on to the belief that, it doesn't have to be who your identity is, maybe in your situation. Even in a situation of, being small and short, or, the size of who you are or where you came from. There's so many reasons that we identify. And I think that unfortunately we program ourselves from early on to think that this is what is the standard and this is what isn't. And what I love about this conversation is that by this, I hope it gives people a hope and a belief that you can be anything that you want to be past what somebody says for you or justifies for you. I wanted to ask you, what was your belief about yourself that you had to question first, though, to really get through that? I mean, obviously, being in middle school and going through that, I'm assuming that that carried with you. Did you know at that point, like, it's okay to be, or like what other instances that
Is
you
there
had to
okay to
go
be
through?
gay? No, I don't think I knew that then, because this was, this was so, this was, I always say the context matters, right? Like, this was 2002, maybe 2003, 2002, I don't know. And early 2000s, Matthew Shepard had just been
Mm,
killed years before.
yeah.
um the on the news, there's certainly, bless you, there certainly was no, there wasn't a lot of representation. The news covered being gay like as if it was a a survival, at best. There wasn't a lot of talk about gay adoption. There wasn't gay marriage. Things moved wonderfully rapidly but, and it was through the work of people who had been doing work for decades, right? And there's still work to be done. But no, I think that I didn't have a script for this, right? Like that's what's interesting, is even me now, something that I come up against, and I don't know if you or some of your listeners feel the same, but uncertainty is really hard. Uncertainty is a really hard thing that I still battle, you know, and the loneliness of uncertainty and um, the anxiety of uncertainty. And, I think in that time, that was a very uncertain time for a lot of people who were LGBTQ, So I think that what I had to do first was um, accept myself, right? And then that's process. I mean, that's a process, because a lot of the ways that we come into ourselves is through ourselves, but also socially. And if you don't have a social container, I know this sounds really technical, but if you don't have a social, sort of infrastructure around you where you can be fully honest and be like, and make mistakes and like say, oh, okay, I'm going to correct this. And when you don't have that, you're doing a lot of sort of like trying to avoid being hurt. So you're not being fully honest, fully forward,
Yeah.
you know. And then, and very importantly, I think, and this is still the case for many people, there's an issue of safety. And, you do need to know that you are, not going to be, brutalized. I mean, look what happened to Matthew Shepard. I actually did a movie that was, based on that. So I think that, there's a lot of trust that you have to work through with yourself. So that was a big part. But I think that that story applies to a lot of people, accepting yourself and then building from there. Right.
I agree. I was thinking actually, I was just on another podcast talking about this. And, the thing is I think we as humans think that we have control over life. And you speak a lot of that uncertainty. That's exactly what it is because we don't have certainty. We don't have control in the real world. The only thing that we have control over, which is kind of this next, as we step into this next part, which is the reinvention that you really talked about. You were dropped by representation, and then you had a choice to make. How do you show up after that? And that's where I think we have more of that control that we can focus on of how do we want to be in this next version of ourselves? How do we root in that? How do we realign? And then how do we rise in that part? So can you talk to us a little bit about that reinvention part and what did you have to release for that?
By the way, I love that. I was listening to your other podcast when you bring up this theme and you're, obviously even in the name. I love that because it's so um, you know, it's so exactly sort of what it aligns with what I'm went through in life, right? And like how we come to these things, we call them different things, but we're all circling around a lot of similar themes. So for me, yeah, I moved to Los Angeles. I went to a pretty great acting conservatory and got great representation out of a showcase just out of college. And I moved out to Los Angeles. And, you know, um, not long after I had which I detail in chapter 10, um, my reps called me in, and the long and short of it, the message was, we didn't know you were gay. This basically makes you unmarketable. And sorry, we don't make the rules. I mean, it wasn't in, and again, context matters. This wasn't 1950, this was 2008. But you know I even say in the book, I don't think that they were bad people. I think that they were trying to reflect back to me, like, the industry is not ready for you to go in for the lead of this and then also be seen at a party with your boyfriend, right? So I like to try to give people grace as much as I can. I don't agree, and it
If
was
only
certainly
they knew what the movement would be now and how they're probably
right,
kicking
right,
themselves.
yeah, heated
Yeah.
rivalry. But I that was really hard because
Yeah.
this was 5 years after this spiritual counseling conversion therapy kind of whatever. And then here I am, and it was the same message, which the message really was that I was taking, unfortunately, and internalizing, was being yourself makes other people uncomfortable.
Mm.
Because it wasn't it was just breathing, right?
Yeah.
Like, so
Yeah.
it's like makes other people uncomfortable. And so to your point about reinvention, I remember after I was let go, I was sitting in my Honda Accord, which is a great car. I drove at 225,000 miles on it, and it had no AC. It was so hot. It was so
In
hot
LA.
in LA, and it was the
Yeah.
summer, and it was really brutal. And I was sitting in the car, and I talk about, you know, just racking my brain and being like, oh my gosh, here we go again. Again, this is going to be a problem. Again, I'm going to have to overcome this. Again, I'm going to have to fight. Maybe I should just quit again, again, again. And then what I realized is that if you turn that around, though, and this was another one of those moments, right, where something just kind of aligns, speaks to you, or however it is you think about it. And I thought, if I switch the word around, it means that I have climbed this mountain before, so it means I can climb it again. Again, I can make a choice. Again, I can take whatever is within my control. And we were talking about uncertainty and what can we control when we reinvent. One of the things that I um, talk about is, I call it the other 50%, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is, to me, it's kind of life changing, which is that at best, some people argue me on this. At best, I would say we have 50% control over our circumstances, because we do control ourselves, right?
Right.
So I can control myself in some capacity,
How
right?
we show up
I
every
control, yeah, I can't control outside circumstances.
right.
I can't control someone else's point of view. And in fact, my life work has been giving that up. Like,
Mm.
like recognizing that you do only have 50%. But there is something in that too, which is that you do have 50%. So if you can use your 50% to align with, because again, some people argue me this too, and I certainly don't want to minimize people's circumstances. But in most cases, you're not receiving all 50% bad from the universe. I use an analogy, like, let's make it really simple. Let's say my back is out. I'm very tall and I have back trouble sometimes. And let's say that my back is out, and let's say that I'm in a really just awful mood about it. And let's say that's throwing me 30% from the universe that is just not going right. But let's also say that, my assistant, who's amazing, um, moved around some clients, or moved around some calls, and so that I could, have a little more time. And maybe that's only helping me like 10%. And then let's say that my sister so sweetly, who she used to be in PT, sends me a like a stretch I can do, right?
Okay.
And that might be another 5% good coming towards me, right? And then my mom door dashes me dinner so that I don't have to make it. And that's another 5%.
Okay.
Well, I can choose. So there's 30% coming against me, there's 20% coming towards me, right? So I can choose to align my 50% with the 20 coming towards me. And I suddenly, now I've got the majority share, right? Or I could choose to align with the 30 and say, really go down that rabbit hole. Again, my book isn't meant to be, like a math problem. I know that that's not life. But I do think that using that analogy in our minds does remind us of the choices that we do have. And as much as we can try to step into that, I've found that to be a good thing for me.
Was there a certain point, or is this an evolving process that you're going through still, that says that you stopped waiting for external validation and you just started leading your life as you are, right? Who you are differently from someone
I
else?
mean, I'm going to need you to coach me on that. I mean, to be honest, yeah, maybe I can sign up for, no, I definitely, that is, yes. Um, that is taken, but that's a process that I continue to come up against. I mean, for sure. I am a people pleaser in many ways, I like for people to be happy. I don't like for people to be mad at me, However, I've had to learn. I really think that that is about the other 50%, learning that there is a line there, that it's only so much you can do, right?
Yeah.
And then, and doing those things, and then laying it down, also understand that part of what you can do is sometimes take a beat and lay it down, right? And I hope I'm not talking in such generalities that it's not easy to understand, but
No,
yes.
I follow you, and I think that the listeners will also because, I think it's I keep hearing in my head as I'm listening to you talk about all of this, even if it's just one person, because for me, that's always the thing. I have found myself growing up. I mean, we could probably talk for hours about this. We all have traumas in our life, no matter where they come from. We almost program our bodies and how we show up in life because of some of those traumas or those experiences that we go through. And for me, I have always been one of those people who thought that I had to show up as a people pleaser, or my production was my purpose. Then people will look at me, and then people will like me. And in reality, I was wearing myself out, and really it was probably exhausting people more to watch me try and be somebody that I wasn't than who I really was. And I think the secret to all of it is if there's one person that you can touch in all of this, and even if it's just yourself, the peace in that is so important in doing that, because once you can find the peace in yourself and that alignment, as easy as it sounds to say, but it actually does reach other people in certain ways that we need it the most. We all have stories where, I mean, even this in itself, just this story, we're all looking for a good hope story, a good happy ending. And I think everybody's imperfect stories is where we all learn and we all gain our own strength in to a certain extent too. I love that.
Yeah, I mean, and think about even with your podcast, how many people you reach who you won't don't meet. You're not meeting them, but in a way, you're meeting them exactly where they are.
Mhm.
By and and I do think that that sense of encouraging others, because I make no bones about it. I had so many people encourage me and I had a real I had some forces against me, but look, I had a lot of encouragement, and I certainly don't want to deny that either. Um, and I own a company. Actually, I started a mentorship and educational consulting company years ago after I had booked this great job on NBC. And what I did, instead of buying not instead of getting a new apartment or getting a brand new car or something, is I fixed the air conditioning in my Honda Accord, and then I started this mentorship and educational consulting company.
Okay.
And so what I see there is, you see and I have a small team, but we are a confidence driven company that meets students where they are and is honest and transparent with them,
Yeah.
but also comes from that encouragement place. And I think that that's important, especially in today's world where there's like division, and look, there's very real things for people to disagree about, no doubt about that.
Yeah.
And those conversations are important. Um, but I think that finding encouragement is and finding sources for that, whether that be this podcast or a book or something, finding that, whether that be a spiritual practice that you have, right? Taking a little time in the morning to center yourself, finding those ways to do that and to get some of that encouragement, and then also to do it for others, because I
Mhm.
do think it's a multiplying benefit,
Yeah.
right? Um, I think that that's key I think it's key in self progress too, because
Mhm.
if there's not encouragement, right? I mean, we are people that move towards things that, quote unquote, feel good or are rewarding in some way, right? So finding those deeper currents that can be rewarding, I think are key.
I think it's important. There are probably people who have now heard you talk about your rise and what you're doing now, which is fantastic. I want to make sure that we put that in the show notes so people know how to reach you for that. What in leadership, for those that have been through all of that and they're starting over,
Mm.
they've gone through rejection. What do you think that they're misunderstanding about starting over that maybe you can kind of help give them a key with?
Well, First of all, it doesn't need to be, the conditions don't need to be perfect to start over. I would say that if there's a central message that I feel so passionately about is that I encourage people to take action, right? Reflect, of course, first, but then take grounded, real action, even if it's just one small thing, right? So it might be, if we think about it, for as long as we live and breathe, we will have to take actions to achieve anything. So, if you're hungry, you can sit and think about being hungry, or you could go make the sandwich, Um, there's, to put it really simply, I really think that we often feel like things need to be perfect. And I think that zaps us. So, it's never going to be the perfect time to start auditioning if that's the thing that you always wanted to do. It's never going to be the perfect time to have that conversation with your partner and say, hey, I want us to move to the next level, right? It's never going to have perfect conditions to, start your business, right? If you want to start a business, like it's a big thing to do. Be smart. Of course, we want to be researched, right? We want to be thoughtful. But I think that that's one thing. I think that the other thing is that, well, I think that another thing that people wanting to start over have trouble with is an acceptance of what is being thrown at you. Like, if the judgments that are being thrown your way are really someone else's script, they don't have to be yours. So there can be and I think that this is a good form of defiance. There can be a defiance of my mother. She's so great. She's actually visiting me right now, which is so great. Um, I know she's visiting me. What she was watching, I love her. She was watching General Hospital in the other room, and I said, "Okay, well, we're gonna have to go outside and watch that because it's gonna bleed through." But anyway, but she used to have a thing, and she was very competitive and great basketball player. We were talking about this last night, where someone would say she couldn't do something, and she'd say, "Watch me do it." We're from South Carolina. She'd say, "Watch me do it." I think that can be a sort of good way to have a healthy defiance that let other people's doubts fuel you as much as you can. Those would be two things that I would think when you start over, because we do have to move past the external script we're given, right? In order to change it, you've
Right.
got to move past it. So you've got to create in your mind. Before I booked a show on the CW. It was their streaming. It launched their streaming channel. Called Beer Fest Thirst for Victory. And I was the number one on the show. It's a bro comedy. I was the romantic lead. And I remember right before that sitting in an acting class, and I said, I was like not working as much as I had been. And I realized some of that script from before about being gay and being a leading man were coming in. And I don't have to blame myself for them coming in, but they just were. And so I had to say to myself, well, you're going to have to really create some belief around the fact that you can be the romantic lead of a show. And sure enough, I then booked this bro comedy, and it was really fun. It didn't go as long as I wish it had. Been 6 episodes, but I think there's a story there, which is like I've got to be able to see it in order to try to flip the script. So I would encourage that healthy defiance, and then also say, it doesn't have to be perfect conditions. Let's just start with, small actions.
I love that. One of the things that I say is bless and release, because when you're growing through things, you can't take things from your old season sometimes, or people even who think that they knew you in that old season. Unfortunately, they can't grow with you unless they're on that same wavelength or level with you. And sometimes we have to bless and release that and know that it's not about us, that they're not ready for that next step, or maybe they're not on that same wavelength. But if you believe it, if you know it, and if you feel that passion burning in you to be more, that's a calling. That's a purpose. That is something in you that says that we're not meant to all be the same. Otherwise, we'd all look the same. We'd all be doing the same thing. We'd all have the same cookie cutter houses and so forth. We are meant to be different and beautifully authentic in our own way. And that is in the same way. You have to find that burning desire in you to be your purpose. And that's what moves you. And until you can visualize that, I don't think you can grow further.
I think you're so right. I think you're so right. And what you said makes me think of something. Here's a little dare to anyone listening who's having a hard time believing in their purpose or maybe even finding their purpose. I would give you humbly offer this. I talk about service in chapter 8. One thing that I've seen, part of this mentorship company, we do something called passion projects, and we encourage young people to, and we give them a program for, researching communities that need some help and might be outside of a community that they even know, and asking them to research those, and then having them do that research, find out the needs of that community, and then take real action that makes impact in that community, educates themselves about the challenges of another person, and educates their peers, right? So in that way, you are creating impact, educating yourself, and spreading the message.
Yeah.
Now, why do I say that? I think community service in general is a great thing to do no matter what. B, what I see, and this can be replicated in adults, it is that what I see is that there's a benefit for both. The community benefits, those people in that community benefit, but the person doing the service also sees the power of their action. The power of, by seeing that real impact that came from educating yourself and then also spreading that message, confidence grows, right? And your understanding of your actual power, right, actually grows. Because if you do a drive for an organization that gets sports equipment, maybe for students who can't afford it, or you do a drive for a special needs organization, right? And that equipment is now being used in the homes, on the field, over there. And let's say you collected 200 things. 200 people's lives are now different because of you. And there's real power in that. And I think so, if someone is struggling, because I love the way that you talk about purpose, and I do think that that's certainly a thing when you often are rebuilding, you're looking to find that purpose again. I think after periods of grief, that can be the case. Certainly it has been for me in my life, or loss. I just think that that's a trick, and it's a good one.
I think it's, we ask ourselves in everything that we're doing, why are we doing what we're doing? That is that purpose. Why are we who we are? And why are we doing what we're doing? Why are we here even on this earth? And I think that's a big, it's a deep question, but I do think it's one that we often ask because we're looking for answers for ourselves. We're looking for the source of where to go next. So I love it. Thank you so much for that. For someone who's listening who feels like maybe they've been rejected, they've been redirected or forced to start over in a point in their lives, what is one decision that they can make this week to take back in ownership of their life?
Mm-hmm. So I would sit down, and again, I say this not because I keep plugging the book, but I say it because it was very important to me that I relate to the reader and say, like, these are all things I did, or these are all things that I failed at, or these are things that I did and they worked. Like, I don't want to, I'm not a perfect person. I make mistakes all the time. And so I'm right here in the muddy pit of life with you, right? And so what I would do is what I did at the start of chapter 3, which is I sat down And I got a sheet of paper, and it was like a yellow notepad or something. And I wrote, "What do you want?"
Mm,
And for me at the time, this was many years ago. This is how I started my company, was that I wanted to keep acting, which I did, but I wanted to find some amount of financial stability, because
mhm,
even though I just booked this new job and it was causing, I mean, it was helping and it really, really helped me, but
mhm,
I had been in debt, and it got me out of debt, but, um, and that was good, but then what comes next? And I talk about wanting a vacation so much, because at that point I was working 72 hours a week. As a young person, I was working, you know um an 8 to 5 assisting job, and then getting off and doing 6 to 10 tutoring, and I was doing that around 5 days a week, and then on the weekends I worked 9 to 7 tutoring
wow.
on Saturday and Sunday. And I really wanted a vacation.
Yeah.
And then I was also auditioning. But I didn't take a vacation then. I used the money to start a company, but I did that from, "What do you want?" And I wrote down, "Keep acting and
Mm,
keep the lights on."
I
And
love that.
that was what led me to then not have all the answers up front. I didn't. How am I going to then that begs the next question. How are you going to do that?
Yeah.
So you need something flexible. That was what I needed. Something I was in charge of, right? And something that I could build that would, and so from there, I started thinking, what are my talents? Where that didn't happen all in that day. So I would just say to anyone out there who is thinking, um, where do I even begin? Have the courage, and I really do mean that, to ask yourself, what do you want?
Mm,
What do I want? And then write it down. Write it down, because research shows that when we write things down, they're much more likely to happen. The other reason I encourage people to write things down is I find that in here, I guess this is voice, but like in your head, um, you know, if it all lives here and it doesn't get out here, that's where people struggle with taking action.
yeah.
So if I even just get it from my head
Mhm.
to a piece of paper, that is at least in itself an action. I have written it down. And that there shows you can take action. And I can also, once I've written something down, I can interact with it, because it's outside of myself. It's not just inside of myself. Think about it. You could think about baking a cake and a new recipe or something, right? And you could think about it. Oh, I don't think that would go with that. I don't think that, no, because that's maybe too much dairy. I don't know. You could do all of that. Or you could bake the cake, and then you could bite into it, and then you can make some decisions, right?
Mm.
So I think that that's what I would encourage someone to do right away.
So good. Thank you so much for that. I love it. It's really writing that what down, is that going back to the root of it all. Where does that start?
Yeah.
Where do we find your book, and where do we hear more about you? How can my listeners connect with you? Because this is so good. I already knew I wanted to read the book. Now I'm like, go get the book.
So much. Yes. So people, probably the easiest way that people can get the book, you can get it, pretty much anywhere books are sold online. But Amazon is a great place to get it. Just because it's easy and it comes right to you. Or if you like Barnes and Noble, we can get it there. That's another easy place to get it. Um, and I want to hear from people. Please feel free to leave an Amazon review if you'd like. And then also on Instagram. I'm an Instagram person, because I find that is the social media that is, I had to get off of Twitter when it was Twitter, and then when it was X. It got a little too
Yeah.
much. So I'm on Instagram at Blake Cooper Griffin, and I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to hear what you think about the book. And then you can also get information on blakecoopergriffin.com.
I love it. And we'll have all that information in the show notes. Before we wrap, if you're navigating a season of transition, reinvention, or decision making yourself, I share deeper leadership insight each week through my newsletter. It's where I break down how to apply those conversations in real life, especially when things don't go as planned. You can find that at mairinmoorecane.com. And as we wrap this week's conversation, I want to remind everyone you don't have to be whole to lead. Leadership doesn't begin once everything is resolved. It begins when you root yourself in truth, when you realign with what matters, and you choose to rise with responsibility right where you are. Thanks so much for joining, and we'll talk to you next time.